Today's session is designed to give you a practical, repeatable framework for developing effective prompts. Our objective is not to memorize a list of magic words, but to build a disciplined approach to writing prompts that produce usable outputs and to improve those prompts through testing and refinement. It is essential to set expectations about how prompt quality improves. In most real-world cases, there is not a single perfect prompt you write once and never touch again. Strong results come from iteration. You run an initial version, identify what is missing or off target, and then adjust one element at a time until the output consistently meets your needs. By the end of this session, you should be able to take any task, whether it is summarizing information, drafting a memo, generating a structured analysis, or producing a formatted deliverable and translate it into a clear prompt with an explicit goal, the proper context, and a quality bar you can use to judge success. A language model is best understood as a probabilistic text generator that has been trained on very large collections of text. It produces an output by continuing whatever input you provide, predicting the next most likely words based on the patterns it learned during training. Because the model is optimizing for what sounds plausible, it can sometimes present incorrect information with high confidence. This is often referred to as a hallucination, and it tends to happen more often when the topic is niche, when details are highly specific, or when the information is time sensitive. This is why prompting matters. Prompting is the primary way we shape what the model produces by giving it the role it should take, the context it should rely on, the constraints it must follow, and the format we want the output delivered in. The clearer and more specific the guidance, the more likely the continuation will be useful. For anything important, we should also build in validation. That can include asking for sources when appropriate, instructing the model to flag uncertainty instead of guessing, and verifying key details externally before using the output. A prompt is the input text you give the model to tell it what to do and how to do it. The most effective prompts read like a professional brief. They state a clear goal, include only the context the model needs, and specify exactly what the deliverable should look like. Here's a quick example of the difference. A weak prompt would be, write about cybersecurity, because it leaves the topic, audience, format, and level of detail open to interpretation. A stronger prompt would be, write a 6-bullet executive summary on ransomware trends in healthcare for a non-technical audience. Keep it under 150 words and include 3 mitigations because it defines the topic, audience, format, length, and required content. Large language models are sensitive to phrasing because the prompt effectively sets the starting state for everything the model generates next. Even small wording changes can shift what the model pays attention to, what it assumes, and how it structures the response. You should evaluate a prompt the same way you would evaluate any professional deliverable. Is it clear? Is it relevant to the task? And will the output be usable without a lot of rework? If the answer is no, the prompt likely needs more direction. In practice, usability usually depends on being explicit about the format, length, and tone you want, as well as the success criteria, meaning what good looks like for this specific use case. Think of the prompt like setting a destination in GPS. If you type downtown, you might end up anywhere in the city center, and the route could vary dramatically. But if you enter a specific address, choose avoid tolls, and set arrive by 9, you have defined the target and the constraints. The model works the same way. Vague prompts produce plausible but variable routes. Specific prompts narrow the path and make the result more predictable. Here is a quick illustration of how small phrasing changes can redirect the model. If you ask, how do we reduce costs? You will get broad generic ideas. If you ask, how do we reduce cloud infrastructure costs in Q2 without impacting uptime or customer experience? You will get more constrained operational recommendations, and the model will prioritize trade-offs differently because the success criteria are now explicit. Let's do a knowledge check. Here are 5 questions. Pause the video, and then you can see what I think the answers are. 1. What is an AI prompt? My answer is that a prompt is the text input you provide to a language model to instruct it to produce a specific output. It's the set of directions that tells the model what you want and how you want it delivered. 2. Why can small wording changes change the output? Large language models are sensitive to wording because they generate responses by predicting continuations from the prompt. The exact phrasing you use influences which patterns the model matches, what assumptions it makes, and which details it prioritizes. 3. What are 3 key criteria for evaluating a good prompt? You should evaluate a prompt using 3 criteria: clarity, relevance, and usefulness. In other words, is the request unambiguous, aligned with the task, and will the output be practical and ready to use? 4. How is a prompt different from a search query? Search tools and prompting serve different purposes. Search primarily retrieves existing information, while prompts can instruct the model to generate new content, transform or rewrite text, summarize, reason through a problem, and format the output in a specific way. 5. Why do prompts help when you lack expertise in the topic? A structured prompt improves results because it forces the work to be explicit. It drives the model to define terms, state assumptions, and follow a logical structure, helping bridge knowledge gaps and reducing the risk of missing key points. When you explain prompt structure, start with the idea of role, because role helps calibrate the model's depth, vocabulary, and point of view. For example, asking it to act as a policy analyst signals that you want a more analytical tone, stronger structure, and language appropriate for that audience. Next, clarify the task, which is simply the what. This is where you specify whether you want the model to write, summarize, extract key points, brainstorm options, critique a draft, build a plan, or do another concrete action. Then add context that describes what the model should use and the boundaries it should follow. Context typically includes the target audience, the domain, any assumptions you want it to make, the data or background information it should rely on, and any exclusions or topics it should avoid. After that, define the format so the output is immediately usable. This is where you specify whether you want bullets or a memo, a word limit, section headings, a table, or a structured format like JSON. Finally, set a clear quality bar to prevent generic one-size-fits-all responses. You can do that by providing an example of the style you want, describing what success looks like, and asking the model to self-check its response for compliance with your instructions before finalizing the output. You can frame a prompt structure like placing an order at a restaurant. The role is choosing the restaurant or chef-style fine dining versus fast casual changes what you get and how it is presented. The task is the dish you are ordering, such as make a salad or cook a steak. The context is your dietary needs and preferences, no nuts, gluten-free, extra protein, or a limited budget which prevents inappropriate choices. The format is how you want it served, family style versus plated, as an appetizer versus an entree, or boxed to go so it is immediately usable. The quality bar is what good means: proper temperature, specific ingredients included, and plating standards so the kitchen can check it meets expectations before it leaves. Example, same task, structured prompt, produces a better deliverable. You can demonstrate the structure with a simple before and after. Unstructured, summarize this document. This typically produces a generic summary and may miss what the audience needs. Structured, act as an executive communications lead. Summarize the attached document for a VP audience in 6 bullet points under 120 words, highlighting the required decision, key risks, and next steps. Avoid jargon. End with one recommended action. Before finalizing, confirm you included the decision, risks, and next steps. This version clearly sets the role, task, context, format, and quality bar. Specificity is what turns open-ended generation into a targeted deliverable. When you clearly define what you want, the model has fewer degrees of freedom, which makes the output more aligned to your intent. Constraints are equally important because they increase predictability and repeatability. By setting boundaries such as length, structure, tone, and required elements, you make it much more likely that repeated runs will produce consistently usable results. A practical way to approach this is to start by specifying the audience, the purpose, and the desired format. Then run the prompt once, review what is missing or off target, and add constraints that directly address those gaps in the next iteration. You can describe specificity and constraints as guardrails. Without guardrails, the model has a very wide road and can wander into content that is plausible but not useful for your purpose. When you add constraints, length, structure, tone, inclusions, exclusions, you narrow the lane and keep the response on track. The result is not only better once, but more consistent across repeated runs. Another analogy is a test specification. If you tell an engineer, make it work, you will get many interpretations and uneven outcomes. If you define what work means, inputs, outputs, performance limits, and acceptance criteria, you get a predictable result and you can repeat it. Constraints in prompts play the same role as acceptance tests. They turn an open-ended request into something measurable. Example, specificity converts topic into deliverable. Write a summary of our Q3 results. This often produces a generic recap with uneven emphasis. Specific, write a 6-bullet exec summary of Q3 results for a non-finance leadership audience. Include revenue versus plan, top 2 drivers, top 2 risks, and 3 next actions. Max 140 words. Use plain language. This clarifies audience, purpose, format, length, and required elements. This matters because even if you are not a domain expert, you can still prompt like one by explicitly asking the model to cover the same layers an expert would consider. Instead of relying on the model to guess what matters, you direct it to include the right dimensions, such as assumptions, risks, trade-offs, stakeholders, constraints, and success criteria. This approach is especially valuable for complex work like strategy, planning, technical design, and policy development, where quality often depends on completeness. In these situations, missing just one critical layer can materially reduce the usefulness of the output, so structuring the prompt to demand full coverage significantly improves results. You can explain this as using an expert checklist. In aviation and healthcare, even experienced professionals use checklists because complex tasks fail when a single critical step is missed. Prompting works similarly. When you are not the domain expert, you can still get expert-like completeness by explicitly asking the model to cover the checklist items, assumptions, risks, trade-offs, constraints, stakeholders, and success criteria so the output does not omit key layers. Example, technical design prompt that prevents missing critical sections. Unstructured, design an API for this feature. This often skips failure modes, security, or operational concerns. Structured, act as a senior software architect. Draft a technical design for the feature, including requirements, non-functional requirements, data model, API endpoints, error handling, security considerations, scalability limits, rollout plan, and monitoring. Call out trade-offs and risks, and list open questions. This mirrors how an expert design doc is organized and reduces omissions. When you build context in a prompt, start with definitions so the model uses consistent terminology and does not improvise meanings. Clear definitions reduce ambiguity and help ensure the output aligns with how you are using key terms. Next, include examples whenever possible, because examples anchor the model to the level of detail, structure, and tone you want. This is one of the most reliable ways to reduce generic boilerplate responses. Finally, add counterexamples to clarify boundaries by explicitly stating what the output should not include. Defining what this is not prevents the model from drifting into adjacent topics or producing content that looks reasonable but is outside your intent. You can frame context building as giving the model 3 things you would give a new team member. First, you provide a shared dictionary so everyone uses the same terms in the same way. Second, you show a strong sample so they understand what good looks like in practice. Third, you call out a short do not do list so they do not accidentally produce something that is technically correct but not what you intended. Definitions tell the model what words mean, examples show what good looks like, and counterexamples draw the boundaries of what to avoid. To raise the quality of the output, it helps to explicitly ask for structure rather than leaving the model to choose its own approach. Frameworks and decision trees are especially useful because they force the response into an organized, actionable format and make it easier to compare options or make a decision. It is also important to request risks and constraints. When the model is prompted to consider limitations, trade-offs, and potential failure points, the recommendations become more realistic and less likely to be unsafe, infeasible, or overly optimistic. Finally, asking for mistakes to avoid is a fast way to increase practical value. It surfaces common pitfalls, helps you anticipate where people typically go wrong, and makes the guidance more directly usable in real-world situations. You can explain frameworks as scaffolding. If you hand someone a pile of bricks, they might build something, but the shape and stability will vary. A framework is the scaffold that gives the response a stable structure sections, decision points, and a logical flow so the output is consistently organized and actionable rather than a loose collection of ideas. Example 1, Framework plus Decision Tree Prompt. If you want a quick example, you can read. Instead of asking, What tools should we use for customer support? Ask, act as a support operations lead. Recommend a tool selection decision tree that starts with team size, channel mix, compliance needs, integrations, and budget. Output the decision tree in bullet form with if, then branches, and end with the top 3 tool categories that fit each path. This shows how a framework and decision tree convert an opinionated answer into an actionable selection process. Example 2. Risks, constraints, and mistakes to avoid turn advice into implementation-ready guidance. You could also illustrate the difference with a planning scenario. Generic, create a rollout plan for a new policy. Higher quality, create a rollout plan for a new policy using a phased approach. Include stakeholder impacts, key risks, constraints, and mitigations. Add a mistakes to avoid section covering the most common rollout failures and specify how we will measure adoption in the first 30 days. This demonstrates how asking for risks and pitfalls produces guidance that is safer and more implementation ready. Frameworks give structure, risks and constraints add realism, and mistakes to avoid adds the practical lessons people usually learn the hard way. To iterate efficiently, change one variable at a time so you can clearly see what caused the improvement. If you adjust multiple elements at once, such as the role, the format, and the constraints, it becomes difficult to know which change actually improved the output. As you iterate, use a simple evaluation checklist to keep the review consistent. Check the response for accuracy, completeness, formatting, and tone, and confirm that it is aligned to the specific use case you are trying to support. Finally, when the requirements are not fully defined, it is often faster to start by asking the model to generate 3 to 5 clarifying questions. Once you answer those questions, you can have the model produce a single, more targeted final response that requires less rework. You can compare prompt iteration to debugging. If a system is misbehaving and you change 5 settings at once, you may fix the issue, but you will not know which change actually mattered, and you will struggle to reproduce the fix later. Iterating on prompts works the same way. Changing one variable at a time makes cause and effect visible and creates a reliable improvement path. One common mistake is overloading the prompt. Adding more text does not automatically improve results, so prioritize only the information that determines the correct output, such as the objective, audience, key constraints, and required format. If you want consistency in formatting and style, few shot examples are especially high leverage. Providing 1 or 2 short examples of the desired output gives the model a concrete pattern to follow and reduces the need for repeated revisions. For factual or high-stakes work, it is also important to build in safeguards. When appropriate, ask the model to include sources and instruct it to clearly separate what it knows from what it is assuming so you can validate the response before using it. You can compare prompt overloading to packing a suitcase. If you throw everything in, you do not get a better trip, you get a heavier bag, less organization, and more friction when you try to find what you actually need. A strong prompt is packed intentionally. Only the items that determine the outcome go in the suitcase, and everything else is left out. This slide provides a copy and paste prompt template that participants can reuse to create consistently high-quality prompts. Start by defining the role you want the model to take, such as act as a policy analyst or act as a project manager, so the depth, vocabulary, and perspective are calibrated correctly. Next, add context so the model understands what it is working with and what boundaries it must follow. Specify the audience, any relevant background, and the constraints that matter. If you have source material or data, paste it into the input section and make it explicit whether the model should rely only on that information. Then state the task clearly by naming the deliverable, specifying what it must include, and calling out what it should avoid. This is where you remove ambiguity about scope and content. After that, define the output format so the response is immediately usable. Specify the structure you want, the length, and the tone, and include any formatting requirements such as headings, bullets, or tables. Finally, set a quality bar so the model checks its work. Ask it to state key assumptions, flag uncertainty or missing information rather than guessing, and perform a final compliance check to confirm it followed the constraints and formatting instructions. Here is an example. 1-minute use case demonstration. You can quickly show how the template adapts to a common workplace task. Imagine I need a leadership update. I set the role to Executive Communications Lead, defined the audience as VP level, pasted the key inputs from the project status, and asked for a 6-bullet summary with 2 risks and next steps. Then, I set a quality bar that forces assumptions and a compliance check. In under a minute, I have a prompt that reliably produces a usable update. When presenting the example, begin by describing what typically goes wrong with an unstructured prompt. You often get a generic, one-size-fits-all program. These exercise choices may not be safe or appropriate for the user, lack progression rules that explain how to improve over time, or have inconsistent or difficult to follow formatting. Then explain that the goal of the structured prompt is to address each failure mode directly. The role statement sets the voice and signals the level of expertise and rigor you expect. The context keeps the recommendations relevant by anchoring the model to the specific user profile, goals, and constraints. Explicit constraints reduce the risk of unsafe content by setting clear boundaries on what is allowed and what must be avoided. Format requirements make the result immediately usable by enforcing a consistent structure that someone can follow without interpretation. Finally, adding a self-check step reduces missed requirements by having the model review its own output against the instructions. Close by noting that the complete example prompt is included in the following slides. The following 3 slides are an example of a prompt. This prompt is for illustrative purposes and do not use it without consulting your doctor and a professional. As you can see, we have the role, context, and core principles. This slide contains the constraints and tasks. Finally, we have the output format and quality check. Run this prompt on any of your favorite AI. To close, reinforce that prompting is best treated as an engineering discipline. You define requirements, test outputs, measure against a quality bar, and iterate until the result is consistently usable. Encourage participants to build a small prompt library for tasks they repeat, such as summaries, memos, analysis write-ups, tables, and checklists. Having a few proven templates saves time, improves consistency, and makes it easier to onboard others to the same standards. Finally, emphasize that for critical decisions, AI output should not be treated as a single source of truth. Participants should verify key facts, rely on authoritative sources where appropriate, and involve a domain expert when the stakes are high or the topic requires specialized judgment.